Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 70 history organizations in and around Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the advisory committee and your host and a professor at Suffolk. And our guest today is Ira Stoll. And Ira Stoll is the author of Samuel Adams, A Life. Thank you for joining us, Ira.
My pleasure to be here.
Great. So I can tell the audience more about your background. That may come up as we're going along, but you are fairly local, Worcester Academy, Harvard, and you live in Cambridge, but you're not writing this out of a parochial interest. So my question is it possible to tell the story of the Revolution without talking about Samuel Adams?
Right. So let me just back up a sec. I live in the city of Boston. I work in Cambridge.
Okay, that's good.
But
my apologies.
No, it's no problem. I won't be insulted. Is it possible to write about the history of the Revolution without Sam Adams? Yes, people do it all the time. Unfortunately, I don't think they're telling the full story. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, because I think that to really tell the full story of the Revolution, you need Samuel Adams because he was an important part of it.
Yeah.
And so the people writing the story of the Revolution without Samuel Adams, they may be focusing on the military part of it, which he really wasn't that involved in. He wasn't carrying a gun or at least during the battles. Yeah. But he was in Congress and he was writing articles in advance, and hopefully we'll get into exactly what role he played. But the argument of this book is that it was very important.
Very important. And he plays a role that we could easily overlook because he writes a lot of things anonymously for the press. You mentioned that he's writing hundreds of these newspaper essays. He's editing the Boston Gazette, and that's really a critical role that we historians might overlook. So for about 20 years, he really is a practicing journalist, as we would know it. He operates a printing press, and he is disseminating his view of the world. It's a fascinating story you tell.
Right. And I had the experience, and I think it's a modern experience of bloggers, maybe anonymous bloggers who have a small media operation. Do you try to make yourself look bigger than you are by writing different pieces under different pen names?
Yeah, Vindix so how do you track down his various pseudonyms?
Right. Well, so that's work that was done before I got there, and there is a multi-volume. I think it's 4 volumes that I have it's sitting on my desk at home. If we were doing this from home rather than my office. The collected writings of Samuel Adams and somebody did that. And
fortunately,
there are some additional things that have been discovered afterwards, but they're few and far between. And in a way that kind of teed it up very nicely. It would have been great to find a discovery in some attic somewhere of hidden letters of Samuel Adams. But as I write in the book, this was a wartime situation, and secrecy was at a premium. And so a lot of times Samuel Adams was in the winter burning copies of his letters in the fire, or in the summer cutting them up into small pieces. It's the letters are more permanent, and newspaper writings are more permanent than obviously email would be, or Snapchat. But the source material, at least the Samuel Adams source material, is pretty well identified.
Yeah. One thing that is really different in your book from other biographies of Samuel Adams is you really do a lot with his religiosity. That is, he's a devout Congregationalist. You can see that infusing his writings, his speeches, and really his attitude. And I wonder how you came to that as a theme for the book, aside from the fact that it's obvious.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you agree that it's obvious. I think there's a tendency in history to react. There's a pendulum, right, in historiography to kind of, you make your name as a historian by correcting the previous trend in historiography, and so I think there's a historiographic story of this where I came on the scene as a student in a age where like the ACLU had helped push a lot of religious education out of American public schools, or talk of religion. So and I'm Jewish. I appreciate the ACLU getting mandatory Christian prayer out of public schools. But I also think it's hard to tell the full story of the American Revolution without discussing the role that religion played. And I think it varies in different parts of the revolution. Like, I learned in school that a lot of the founders were deists. They believed in an abstract clockmaker god, and that's true about some leading figures in the American Revolution, but it wasn't true about Samuel Adams. And that's the story that I try to tell to adjust the what I saw as the story that I learned in high school. And the truth is, like, there's a personal aspect of it too. I mentioned I'm Jewish, and that's an important part of my identity. And so I felt like a little bit like I could relate to Samuel Adams going to church, and the idea that I don't know, the story of the Bible and the Exodus from slavery was like a real motivating story for him. That was in a genuine way. And so sometimes if somebody's coming at it from a more secular, modern perspective, they may have a hard time identifying with that. But I'm glad you agree that it's hard to miss. And because I do think for Samuel Adams, whose father-in-law was a minister, and who, everybody who wrote about him, like, stressed this religious aspect. It's just there all throughout the sources. It's there.
It is, yeah. And there's that critical moment at the First Continental Congress when they decide to begin with a prayer, and everyone kind of looks to these New Englanders. How will they react to that? And Samuel Adams makes the motion to have one of the clergy of Philadelphia. That is, we're not going to insist on a Congregationalist because we know there are lots of different faiths here, or people of lots of different beliefs here. So that's really a critical moment in trying to forge a nation out of these different, really disparate places. That's a bigger story, which I don't know that we need to talk about right now, but there's plenty more to talk about with Samuel Adams. We're talking with Ira Stoll, who is the author of Samuel Adams, A Life. And I think one thing we know about Samuel Adams, which might not necessarily be true, but Samuel Adams, the brewer, the guy on the beer cans, beer bottles. Can you tell us a little bit about that side of this?
The story that I like to tell about this is, when I was promoting this book, I did one event at the New York Historical Society and one event at the Boston Public Library. And the New York Historical Society, there was a fee to attend. It was like $10 or $25 a ticket. And it got a huge crowd, like 200 or 300 people. And the Boston Public Library event was free. And it was a small enough crowd that was actually kind of embarrassing. C-SPAN Book TV was there. And they said, we don't usually do this, but we're going to ask you to crowd in into the front row seats so that it looks a little more crowded for Ira. And I was thinking to myself, well, what is this? Like Samuel Adams of Boston? Aren't people interested in a local story of the American Revolution? And it turned out the New York Historical Society event had a partnership with the Samuel Adams Beer Company. So there was beer after the event.
Wow. And
the Boston Public Library, of course, they're not serving alcohol in the Boston Public Library, at least for a book talk. So I learned from that beer is a powerful thing in getting out crowds for author events.
Yes.
And I think in part because of the beer company, the brewer aspect of Samuel Adams has been maybe a little bit overemphasized in the popular imagination. I get into it a little bit. He was a maltster, but there is a certain truth to the idea that people were gathering in Boston in coffee houses and in taverns and discussing the events of the day, and in a kind of civic engaged way that that helped build the popular support for the revolutionary cause, just as newspaper articles and letters to committees of correspondence, and the underlying substance and the sermons from the ministers, all those things work together. The popular events like the Liberty Tree and marches like that. So all those things are kind of working together to build popular support for the revolutionary cause.
Yeah. And he really is a master organizer in a way that I think is worth studying. But then the unfortunate thing is he burned most of his papers, and where he's talking about how he does this. You have these revolution happening on different levels, and he seems to be the one pulling a lot of this together, or pulling the strings. And is that it?
Yeah, I mean, pulling the strings. Pulling the strings is probably like slightly a little more manipulative than I might.
I didn't want to suggest he ever did a wrong thing.
Yeah. I'm a big defender of Samuel Adams, but there's a camp of historians, and certainly the British would portray it this way, who felt that Samuel Adams was stoking up the Boston mob, and in a kind of sinister way. And I'm a proud American, and I think the revolutionaries were correct to want to govern their own affairs, and not be ruled by Britain, where they didn't have a vote, especially on matters like taxes, like taxation without representation. So, there's a limit to how much even a talented organizer can do to organize a population into a cause that they don't have some underlying sympathy with on the merits. So this concept of like Samuel Adams as a propagandist I think he was an excellent communicator and worker of the political process. But I think what part of what made him excellent is his ability to argue the merits of the case in a way that that resonated with the colonists' underlying ideology of liberty and freedom.
Right. He's not making the best of a bad case. He's making the best of a good case, I think. And we're talking with Ira Stoll, author of Samuel Adams, A Life. And, I was thinking as you were talking about whether Peter Oliver talks about Adams in his History of the Revolution. Peter Oliver, the loyalist, brother-in-law of Thomas Hutchinson, essentially says Adams did all of this because he hated Thomas Hutchinson. John Adams later said that if the American Revolution was a blessing and not a curse, history will remember Samuel Adams. And Samuel Adams seems one of the few historical characters whom John Adams doesn't foam with jealousy when he hears about. He sees Samuel Adams playing this vital role, which even in his lifetime was being undervalued and underappreciated, which is interesting to see. And when John Adams goes to Paris, people ask if he is the famous Adams. And he corrects them, no, you mean my cousin. And so why is it that Samuel Adams then does, not, he does seem to, he retreats from Congress. As you make the point, he does spend as many more years in Congress than most people would want to. But then, of course, he spends the rest of his career in Massachusetts as a member of the state, president of the state Senate and governor, which are very significant things here in the Commonwealth. But why doesn't he? I guess the question is, why isn't he as well known as we think he should be?
Yeah. So I get into this in the conclusion of my book. And I offer a couple of suggestions. One is that, as the federal role increased, that Samuel Adams, who after the Revolution was in a state role and before the Revolution was in a city of Boston or town of Boston role, state and local just became less prominent. So I think that is part of the reason. I think that maybe because he was so religious, that the secular trend kind of worked against him. And I think that he was like eclipsed a little bit by the other Adams, who was president of the United States, which Samuel Adams never was. So I think even in his day in Massachusetts, Massachusetts was changing, and so Congregationalism was fading in favor of Unitarian Universalism and Catholicism, and the like science and industry were coming up, and so like Samuel Adams was seen a little bit by these new Federalists as a kind of person of the past.
He opposes ratifying the Constitution. He comes to support it somewhat reluctantly with a promise of amendments, which is a very important story. And then he loses in a race for Congress to Fisher Ames, I think. And also I think the thing too, he is older. He's about, actually I was really pleased to see on one of the, a coaster for Samuel Adams beer in 1773, a fiery young revolutionary. I'm thinking, well, in 1773, he's 51 years old, which, which could be young, but he is. He's not a young man. He's 10 years older than Washington and a dozen years older than his cousin. And so I think we have to give him credit for what he does when he is in his prime.
Right, and life expectancy then was less, and healthcare was worse. So being in your 50s in the 1770s is not the same as being in your 50s
That's right.
now with exercise and
Yeah.
low carb diets and high
Yeah.
blood pressure medicine.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we're talking with Ira Stoll, author of Samuel Adams, A Life. And so, what can you tell us about the Boston that Samuel Adams really dominates in the 1750s, 60s, 70s when he's the leader of the town meeting? And he's played such a he's head of this caucus club that his father had started, and he's writing this newspaper. And why does the revolution happen here, I think, in Boston? What's special about Boston?
Yeah, well, I mean, I really encourage people to not just read books like mine, but to get out and walk the streets, go on some of those house tours, go visit the Museum of Fine Arts or the Bostonian Society or the Old South Church, and the physical stuff is still there. I try to tell some of that story in my book, and you go to the Museum of Fine Arts in the room where that picture, the portrait of Samuel Adams is, and I think in the same room, at least when I did the research for this book, there's a portrait of, I think it's Nicholas Boylston, who's dressed in much fancier clothing than Samuel Adams. And if you look at some of the Revere silver, we have this idea that sometimes that it's like Thanksgiving and they're just barely surviving at Plymouth Plantation with the Indians and stuff. But Boston by 1760s, there were people doing pretty well. There were ships going back and forth to England and gorgeous silver, and so there was property to defend in these tax fights, and that's part of why Britain wanted to raise the taxes. They saw these colonists as I don't want to push the contemporary metaphors, but it's a little bit like, people don't want to tax themselves to pay for things. They want to tax other people. And they saw these colonists as a place to tax, whether it was tea or paper. So there was wealth to be. There was wealth and there was growth. There were ups and downs depending on pandemics or economic upturns or downturns. But in general, Boston was booming, and the towns outside were also people would bring crops to market in Boston, and it wasn't like everybody had their own little farm in Boston. They had cooks, and they were eating the food from the surrounding countryside.
Yeah. So Boston is doing pretty well, and it's one of the things they want to preserve, that as well as the fact that they always had governed themselves. I mean, the town meeting is really this potent thing, and so it's not just a sense that they controlled their destiny, but it's the fact. And that's I love that portrait of Samuel Adams too, because he's pointing at the Massachusetts Charter and he's holding the instructions from the town of Boston to him, their representative. So it's really making this point about where power comes from and having a written charter, a written constitution, which is really something different from the experience of England, and also why at that moment he's in this big fight with Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, because the rules are changing. And so we'll let Parliament call the shots, and Samuel Adams in the portrait is saying, no, that this is how it's spelled out in the charter. And his other hand is resting on the town of Boston minute book. And It's a fascinating portrait, and I think, did John Hancock commission it? Do you know?
Yeah, so exactly. So there's also a portrait of Hancock, and it was expensive to hire someone as famous and good as John Singleton Copley to paint your portrait, and it was Samuel Adams was always poor until the end of his life. I mean, he wasn't dirt poor, as he was wealthy enough to go to Harvard and stuff, but he was never as rich as Hancock.
No.
And so Hancock commissioned this portrait, and it was part of this kind of frenemy relationship that he had with Hancock, where Samuel Adams was always kind of jealous of Hancock for his wealth, but he also needed Hancock to back him, and so in matters as personal as commissioning the portrait. And so yes, you're right to mention that relationship as an important one.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about this Hancock-Adams relationship? Because it seems to us they're joined at the hip, but there was a great deal of tension, animosity between them, which may be inevitable in political alliances like this one.
Right. So I think there's envy, there's jealousy, there's rivalry, political rivalry. Hancock was elected as president of the First Continental Congress, and I think that was a job that Samuel Adams would have been happy to have gotten himself. And in letters home, he rued how voters were impressed by Hancock's riches, and that seemed to him to run counter to the proper moral, virtuous approach. And sometimes he made fun of Hancock, who used to run around with all these white horses, and that could be a hassle if you were trying to get to and from Congress with all these white horses that you had to feed and put up in the local inn.
Yeah, and there's a story of the morning of Lexington and Concord, when Hancock is obsessed with having this beautiful roast salmon, and Adams understands the importance of this day, and it's a singular moment of these two guys there when the war actually begins.
Yeah, and the British, the British were under the impression that if they could just get Samuel Adams and John Hancock and put them in jail, that the whole thing would be over, which we never got to see if they were right about that. But it was a close call.
Yeah, but do you think they were right?
I think if they had captured both Samuel Adams and John Hancock early on and imprisoned them in Britain or killed them, I think that could have made a big difference. I think it's impossible to know, but I think it would have set back the revolutionary cause considerably.
Okay. We're talking with Ira Stoll, author of Samuel Adams, A Life. Now, you're not by profession an historian, so I do want to ask, what drew you to writing this really terrific work of history?
Well, I was a history major in college, and I took a course with Professor Bernard Balin, who's a giant of the field, which made a real impression on me. And I grew up in Massachusetts as a kid, going to Old Sturbridge Village and walking the Freedom Trail. So I was always interested in this stuff, and I am a professional writer and editor. So, and there's a tradition, I think, of non-academics writing books about, certainly biographies about figures in the American Revolution. Like, David McCullough is not an academic historian, and Walter Isaacson isn't either. And, not that I would put myself in their league, but they were certainly models for this project. So it felt like it was within grasp. And, I think in some of the reviews by the academic historians, they weren't all positive. And, so I got reviews like, Stoll's a better writer than most academic historians, but he got this and this and this little fact wrong, which fair enough. I'll take the praise of the writing, but the book really sold like that. That's that was the other kind of, it really outdid my expectations. And I think, to some extent corrected that fading of Samuel Adams in the popular memory of the historian. And I think it really hit with a whole religious audience who identified with this idea that the religious aspect of the motivation of the revolutionaries had been unjustly written out of history.
Yeah, we have William Billings and Jonathan Mayhew, these other kind of precursors to this. And it really is a very important part of the story. And since then, you've written a biography of John F. Kennedy. Do you have in the works any other biographies?
Not at the moment.
Okay, so if I feed you some names, you might become intrigued. Or...
People are always suggesting, like, oh, you should write a biography of this person or that person. Usually, they're either too obscure or they're too famous. Like, if they're too obscure, no one's going to care about them. And if they're too famous, they've already been written about extensively. So I was lucky I got to Samuel Adams precisely when I did, because he was right at that perfect, Goldilocks, not too obscure and not too famous.
Good. And we'll leave aside the historians who are consumed with jealousy that you write really well and that your book sells. But it's Ira Stoll, the author of Samuel Adams, A Life. And I want to thank you for joining us and thank everyone for listening. We started this podcast about a year ago thinking we would reach an audience, in and around New England. And actually we have, but also we have listeners every week. I check. And so this week, I just want to thank the folks in Alfred, Maine, and Alexandria in Egypt, and Alpine, California, as well as Innsbruck in Austria. As we have a global audience listening in on the story of the American Revolution on Rev 250, and now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. So thanks, Ira, for joining us.
My pleasure.